Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that will make your daily commute, your wardrobe choices, and your most recent argument about what to watch on Netflix feel like absolute non-issues. Tonight, we're talking about Iran, specifically the wildest, most whiplash-inducing social transformation of the 20th century. How Iranian women went from wearing miniskirts and sunglasses in the 1960s to mandatory hijabs overnight. Not over decades, not gradually, overnight. One morning you woke up and the rules of being a woman had been completely rewritten while you were sleeping. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and you clearly have excellent taste in deeply unsettling history. Suggestions like yours are the reason this channel exists, and I mean that. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always midnight somewhere, and somehow that person is always the most invested. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you prefer your historical spirals in audio form, the link is in the description. Now, dim the lights. Put on a fan if you've got one. Get horizontal. Tuck yourself in. You're safe. You're comfortable. You exist in a time when you can choose what to wear tomorrow morning without it being a matter of law enforcement. But before you drift off, sit with a few questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live through a revolution? Not the dramatic movie version, but the slow, strange Tuesday morning version where you go to work and the rules have changed. What does a woman do when the government starts having opinions about her hair? What happens to the women who liked the old rules or the ones who hated them? Could you have survived a decade of political whiplash, two different sets of corrects, womanhood and a war on top of it all, while also just trying to get groceries? What does it feel like to watch your country argue about your body like it's a policy document? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Tehran. The year is 1979. The revolution has just won. Your closet is about to become a political statement, and nobody asked your opinion. Let's start in the good old days, or at least someone's version of them. It's the 1960s in Tehran, and if you squint, you might mistake it for a European capital having a very good year. Women are at university, women are in government, women are wearing what they please, which includes miniskirts, sleeveless blouses, and sunglasses that cost more than your grandfather's entire wardrobe. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was on a fast, loud, heavily oiled sprint toward what he called modernization, and women were both the symbol and the proof of that project. You're a young woman in Tehran in, say, 1968. You have opinions about Godard films. You attend lectures at the University of Tehran, which is a real, functioning, co-educational institution where nobody monitors your hemline at the door. After class, you might go to a cafe in the northern part of the city where the coffee is strong and the conversation is even stronger. In the evenings, there are discotheques, actual discotheques, with actual dancing, and restaurants that serve wine, and cinemas playing imported films that have not been edited by anyone with a religious agenda. There is a social scene, and you are in it, and nobody from any government office is stopping you on the street to assess the angle of your scarf. Now, here is the part they don't always include in the highlight reel. The Tehran you just woke up in is a city of extreme contrasts. The miniskirts and the discotheques belong to a specific slice of the population. Urban, educated, often wealthy, concentrated in the northern neighbourhoods of the capital. If you step outside that world, into the southern districts, into the rural provinces, into the small cities and towns where the majority of Iranians actually lived, the picture looks completely different. Women there dressed conservatively because they wanted to, because their families expected them to, because faith was not a political performance but a daily reality. The Shah's modernization project was, in many ways, a project for the elite. conducted in the name of everyone. The Shah himself was a complicated piece of work. He genuinely believed in industrialization, in education, in projecting Iran as a sophisticated modern nation-state that belonged in the same conversation as France or West Germany. He built universities, factories and roads. He sent students abroad. He pushed through land reforms and expanded literacy programs. On the surface, it looked like progress, and in some measurable ways, it was. But the Shah also had a secret police force called SAVAK, which we will get to shortly, and his modernization came with a very firm caveat. You could have a miniskirt, you could have a university degree, you could have a government job, as long as you kept your mouth shut about anything that resembled political dissent. Freedom of fashion, yes. Freedom of speech, considerably less so. The shops were full. The prisons were also full. What the Shah did not fully account for was the way this contradiction was accumulating pressure. The educated classes he had cultivated were reading things. The religious classes he had sidelined were listening to recordings of a very angry cleric in exile. And the enormous middle of the country, neither discotheque nor seminary, was watching the gap between the Iran on television and the Iran they actually lived in grow wider every year. The miniskirts were real. The progress was real. The deep, structural fault lines running underneath all of it were also real. And in Tehran in 1968, you are dancing on top of them, completely unaware that the floor is about to give way. Here's the thing about being a symbol of progress. Nobody really asks if you want the job. In 1963, the Shah launched his White Revolution, a sweeping package of reforms meant to drag Iran into the 20th century by the collar. Women got the vote. Women got the right to run for office. Women got divorce protections they'd never had before. On paper, it sounded like a victory. In practice, it was complicated because these rights were handed down from above by a man who also ran a secret police force and had a habit of throwing critics in jail. You are a woman in 1963 and you have just been handed the vote. Let that settle for a moment. 40 years after American women got suffrage, 20 years after French women, here it is, your legal right to participate in the political process. Congratulations. Now, who are you voting for? Well, candidates approved by the Shah's government, in elections monitored by the Shah's government, under a political system that exists entirely at the pleasure of the Shah. The vote was real in the narrow technical sense and approximately decorative in every practical one. Welcome to progress, Iranian style. The White Revolution also included land reform, profit sharing for industrial workers, a literacy corps, and the nationalization of forests. It was, by any serious measure, a dramatic restructuring of Iranian society. The Shah presented it as a revolution from above, which is a phrase that should always make you nervous, because revolutions from above tend to serve the person at the top. For women specifically, the Family Protection Law of 1967 was the piece that mattered most. It raised the minimum age of marriage, gave women the right to initiate divorce, and gave mothers a real claim to child custody. These were not small things. In a legal system that had previously treated women as almost entirely subject to male authority in domestic matters, these reforms had tangible effects on real lives. Women who'd been trapped in abusive marriages now had a legal mechanism to leave. Women who had lost children to ex-husbands had a new argument to make in court. But here is the catch that kept catching. The women's rights activists who had actually been organising and advocating for these changes for decades, who had been arrested, blacklisted and surveilled for pushing exactly these ideas, were not the ones who got credit for them. The Shah announced the reforms. The Shah took the applause. The women who had done the political labour watched a man claim their work as his vision, which is a deeply familiar experience and not limited to Iran in the 1960s. Outside the cities, the reforms landed differently. For many rural and religious families, the family protection law was not progress. It was interference. It was a secular government reaching into the most intimate structures of their lives and rearranging them according to values they had not chosen and did not share. The clerical establishment was furious. A young Ayatollah Khomeini called the reforms an attack on Islam and was thrown out of the country for saying so, which, as decisions go, was a bit like putting out a fire by pouring it into a bucket and handing it to your neighbour. The rights were real. The resentment was also real. And the Shah, charmed by his own image as a modernizing monarch, did not fully grasp that you cannot give people rights with one hand and take their voice with the other and expect gratitude indefinitely. Progress, it turns out, comes with fine print. While Tehran's elite were sipping cocktails and debating French cinema, the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, were busy making sure nobody asked too many questions about how the whole operation worked. SAVAK was not subtle. They monitored, arrested, tortured, and disappeared people who criticised the government, and by people I mean intellectuals, communists, religious activists, and anyone who looked at the wrong pamphlet for too long. The modernization was real. So was the repression, and both of them, together, were quietly building the pressure that would eventually blow the lid off everything. You're a university student in Tehran in 1971. You're studying literature. You've been reading things, not illegal things technically, but the kind of things that suggest you might develop opinions, which is where the trouble starts. One of your professors has recently stopped turning up to class. Someone you know from a study group was picked up last month and hasn't been seen since. You have learned, with the efficiency of someone who has absorbed the lesson without being explicitly taught it, that there are things you do not say out loud, people you do not mention, and ideas you keep entirely inside your head. SAVAK was established in 1957 with assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, which tells you something about the geopolitical mood of the time. Its official job was to protect national security. Its practical job was to protect the Shah. The distinction between those two things had become, over the years, essentially non-existent. At its peak, SAVAK had somewhere between 3,000 and 60,000 employees depending on the estimate, plus an enormous network of informants. Your neighbour might be reporting on you. Your colleague at work might be. The informant network was so pervasive that trust as a social phenomenon became a kind of luxury. The torture was not rumoured, it was documented, reported and known. Amnesty International wrote about it. Former prisoners described it. The methods were sophisticated in the way that things become sophisticated when a lot of institutional effort goes into them. This was happening in the same city, where women were attending university and wearing miniskirts and attending discotheques, both. Things were true simultaneously. The nightclub and the interrogation room existed in the same city, sometimes on the same street. What SAVAK accomplished in the end was not security. It accomplished silence, a surface silence that everyone knew was performed, which is somehow more corrosive than honest dissent. Iranians became expert at saying one thing and meaning another, at maintaining a public face and a private one, at navigating the gap between what was permitted and what was real. This skill, this specific, exhausting, necessary skill, would prove enormously useful in the decades after the revolution, when the same gap reappeared under entirely different management. The Shah's Iran was modern and repressive simultaneously. These were not contradictions in his mind. They were features. The modernity was the advertisement. The repression was the mechanism that kept the advertisement running. What he did not understand was that you cannot build a society on performed loyalty indefinitely. Eventually the performance ends, and in 1978 the audience stopped pretending. While the Shah threw parties and built highways, a 70-something cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini was sitting in exile, first in Iraq, then in France, and he was absolutely livid. Khomeini had been thrown out of Iran in 1964 for publicly opposing the Shah's reforms, which he considered an attack on Islam, on tradition, and on the basic dignity of Iranian life as he understood it. He was not the quietly stewing type. From exile, he preached, recorded cassette tapes, and built a following that crossed every class line in Iranian society. He didn't use a megaphone. He used something more powerful, a cassette player and a very long memory. You need to understand something about Khomeini before you can understand anything that follows. He was not a moderate who radicalized. He was not a politician who pivoted. He was consistent in a way that, depending on your perspective, reads either as principled or terrifying, possibly both. His opposition to the Shah was theological, political, and personal, and it had been building since the 1950s. He believed that Islamic law should govern the state, that clerics had both the right and the duty to lead it, and that the Shah's secular modernization project was a form of cultural colonialism dressed up in imported suits. In Najaf, Iraq, where he lived for 13 years, Khomeini refined and taught his political theory of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The idea, roughly, was that in the absence of the hidden imam, a qualified religious scholar should govern the Islamic community. This was not a mainstream clerical position at the time. Many senior ayatollahs found it too radical, too political, too much a departure from the traditional separation between religious scholarship and state power. Khomeini did not appear to find their skepticism particularly compelling. What made him uniquely dangerous from the Shah's perspective was not just his theology, it was his tone. He spoke about the Shah's government with a contempt so clear and direct that it cut through the usual fog of political language. He called the Shah a corrupt puppet of America and Israel. He called the White Revolution an attack on Islam. He described the suffering of ordinary Iranians in terms that resonated with the religious poor in ways that secular leftists simply could not replicate, because he was speaking their language, literally and spiritually. When he was expelled to Iraq in 1964, the Shah presumably expected that exile would reduce his influence. It did not. When Iraqi pressure led to his departure for France in 1978, the Shah presumably expected that moving him farther away would help. It made things considerably worse. Sitting in a village outside Paris named Neauphle-le-Château with international journalists lining up outside his door and satellite telephone connections to Tehran that the Shah could not easily intercept, Khomeini became more accessible to the world and to Iran than he had ever been in Najaf. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they are absolutely certain they are right. He had been waiting 15 years. He could wait a little longer. And in Tehran, in the autumn of 1978, the waiting was almost over. You want to know one of the most unhinged facts about the Iranian Revolution? It was, in part, organized by cassette tape. Before Twitter, before YouTube, before any of the tools we now associate with political organizing, Khomeini's sermons were recorded in a Paris apartment, smuggled into Iran in luggage and inside hollowed-out goods, and copied by hand-on-tape duplicators in mosques and living rooms across the country. Every copy begat another copy. Every copy reached another family, another neighborhood, another young man or woman who had never heard anyone speak quite like this. The Shah had jets and oil money. Khomeini had audio equipment and timing. Think about what a cassette tape meant in 1978. It was portable. It was easily hidden. It could be copied on equipment that was already commercially available. It left no paper trail. It could be listened to in private. It could be passed from hand to hand like a rumour made tangible. The Shah's government was very good at monitoring printing presses, arresting journalists, and confiscating pamphlets at border crossings. It had no particular playbook for a revolution conducted in 90-minute magnetic strips. The sermons themselves were not abstract theological lectures. They were direct, emotionally precise, and built around a central argument that ordinary Iranians could grasp immediately. The Shah has sold your country, betrayed your faith, humiliated your people, and the time to say so is now. Khomeini spoke about poverty, about dependence on foreign powers, about the corruption of the elite, about the dignity of the ordinary Iranian, and he spoke about all of it in religious terms that gave it a weight and urgency that secular political arguments simply did not carry for the same audience. In the mosques, the tapes were played after prayer. In private homes, they were listened to in hushed groups. Younger members of the network were tasked with duplicating them. You would sit for hours in a back room with 2 cassette players, pressing record, producing copies to be distributed before the week was out. The whole operation had a logic to it that was almost entrepreneurial, except the product was revolution and the distribution network was powered by faith. The Shah's government eventually recognized what was happening and tried to crack down on the tapes. This was approximately as effective as trying to stop weather. By the time SAVAK was actively pursuing tape networks, the networks had become too distributed, too embedded in everyday social structures, too woven into the fabric of religious community to be dismantled through arrests and raids. There is something almost beautiful about it, in a vertiginous kind of way. One of the most significant political transformations of the 20th century was partially organized through a technology that also gave us recorded music, language learning programs, and eventually mixtapes. The revolution that ended Miniskirts in Iran was distributed on the same format as Fleetwood Mac's Rumours. History has a very strange sense of humour. The revolution didn't announce itself politely. Through 1978, strikes, protests, and street demonstrations built into something no one could ignore. Millions of Iranians from every background flooding the streets, demanding the Shah go. In January 1979, the Shah left Iran for what would turn out to be the last time, framing it as a vacation. Nobody was fooled. Khomeini flew home from Paris in February to a crowd of several million people. What happened next depended entirely on who you were and what you'd been hoping for, because the revolution had been many things to many people, and not all of them were about to get what they wanted. You're in Tehran on February 1st, 1979. Khomeini's plane has just landed at Mehrabad Airport. The crowd outside has been estimated at between 3 and 5 million people, which is a number so large it essentially loses meaning. Imagine every person you've ever met multiplied by an incomprehensible factor, all standing in the same city, waiting. The air has the particular quality of a historical moment, which is to say it feels both enormous and ordinary simultaneously, the way all lived history does from the inside. People are crying, people are cheering, people are holding photographs and flags and children on their shoulders. Whatever comes next, this moment is real. But here is the thing that gets lost in retrospect when revolutions are tidied into neat narratives. In February 1979, almost nobody agreed on what they had just made. The leftists believed they had made a socialist revolution with a temporary religious phase. The liberals believed they had made a democratic revolution with some religious aesthetics. The nationalists believed they had made an independence movement, and that Khomeini was a figurehead. The religious conservatives were the only faction that believed they had made an Islamic Republic, and they were the only ones who were correct, which is the kind of irony that tends to become clear only after it is too late to be useful. The Shah's government dissolved. The army, faced with a choice between massacring millions of its own citizens or standing down, stood down. The Pahlavi monarchy, which had ruled Iran for 57 years, evaporated with a speed that stunned everyone, including the people who'd been working to end it. Power had moved. Where it had moved to was still, in those first days, genuinely unclear. In the provisional government, secular nationalists held official positions. On the streets, Revolutionary committees with Khomeini's blessing were establishing control. In the mosques, clerics were taking administrative authority. 3 parallel power structures were operating simultaneously, and 2 of them were under a significant misapprehension about who was actually in charge. The misapprehension was resolved over the following months in favour of Khomeini's faction. It was resolved through a constitutional referendum that happened very quickly, with a ballot that offered 2 options: Islamic Republic, yes or no. There was no third option, no version that said Democratic Republic or secular state. The question had been decided before it was asked. By the time the liberals and leftists understood what had happened, the mechanisms for reversing it were no longer available. The revolution belonged to the people who had been clearest about what they wanted. Everyone else had assumed they were on the same side. Here is a deeply uncomfortable fact about the 1979 revolution. It wasn't just religious conservatives. Secular leftists were in it. Feminists were in it. Marxist students were in it. Writers, artists, labour organisers, all of them marched alongside the religious factions because they all agreed on one thing: the Shah had to go. What they disagreed on was everything that came after. The moment the Shah left, the coalition that had seemed so unified started discovering how little they had in common. And in the jostling for what came next, the faction with the clearest vision, the most organised structure, and the absolute least interest in compromise came out on top. You are a secular feminist in Tehran in the spring of 1979. You marched, you handed out pamphlets, you organised, you attended the rallies, and you believed, with the genuine conviction of someone who has done the work, that what you were building was a society with more rights for women, not fewer. You looked at Khomeini and you heard him speak about justice and dignity and the humiliation of Iran under foreign influence, and you thought, wrongly as it turned out, that you were talking about the same things. The Iranian left in 1979 was not a unified force. It was a spectacular variety pack of factions. The Tudeh party, which was communist and Soviet-aligned, the Mujahedin Khalq, which combined Marxism with Islamic thought in a way that pleased almost nobody, the Fedayeen, who were Marxist guerrillas, various nationalist groupings, liberal Democrats of the Mossadegh tradition. These factions disagreed with each other on almost everything, which made coordinated political action somewhat difficult. What they shared was opposition to the Shah and a collective failure to take seriously the possibility that Khomeini meant exactly what he said. The women's movement had its own fractures. Some feminists argued that criticising Khomeini's religious conservatism was a distraction from the anti-imperialist struggle and would hand ammunition to the Shah's supporters. Others argued that women's rights were non-negotiable and had to be defended immediately. The former group accused the latter of playing into Western narratives. The latter group turned out to have been correct, which was cold comfort. What Khomeini's organisation had that no other faction possessed was a pre-existing national infrastructure, the mosque network. Every neighbourhood had one, every town had one. They were already organised, already trusted, already embedded in the social fabric in a way that no political party, however passionate, could replicate from scratch in 6 months. When the new state needed to extend its reach into every corner of Iranian society, the religious infrastructure was already there. It just needed to be activated. The leftists, the liberals, the feminists, they found themselves, one by one, either co-opted, marginalised, imprisoned, or fled. The Islamic Republic did not arrive at its final form overnight. It arrived through a series of steps, each of which was easier, because the previous step had already been taken and the coalitions that might have resisted it had already been divided. The revolution that many people made was replaced gradually and then suddenly by the revolution that one faction wanted. And by the time the others fully understood what had happened, the machinery was already running. 8 days after Khomeini returned to Iran on International Women's Day in March 1979, thousands of Iranian women took to the streets not to celebrate the revolution, to protest it. Khomeini had just announced that women working in government offices would be required to wear the hijab. Women who had marched for the revolution, who had believed they were fighting for freedom, were now in the streets chanting against the man they'd helped bring to power. It was one of the largest women's protests in Iranian history. It lasted several days, and in the long run, it didn't stop what was coming. You have been on your feet for 3 days, your voice is gone. You're marching with tens of thousands of women through the streets of Tehran chanting, "We did not make a revolution to go backwards." Some of the men on the sidelines are supportive, others are not. There are men shouting at you that you are agents of imperialism, that you are being manipulated by foreign powers, that your objection to mandatory hijab is itself a form of counter-revolutionary activity. This is, in the vocabulary of 1979 Iran, one of the worst things anyone can call you, and it is being deployed specifically to silence women who are raising questions about women's rights. Note the efficiency of the maneuver. The protest had been triggered by a specific statement from Khomeini that women in government employment must wear hijab. For many of the women in the street, this was the first concrete sign that the revolution's promises about freedom did not extend to them in the way they'd understood. They responded the way people respond when they discover they have been misled about something significant, loudly and immediately. The demonstrations drew women from across the political spectrum, secular feminists, religious women who wore hijab voluntarily but objected to compulsion, professional women who had built careers in government and did not intend to be managed out of them. For a brief, extraordinary few days, the streets of Tehran contained a feminist uprising in the middle of a revolutionary government's first weeks in power. Khomeini's response was measured in one sense and absolutely clear in another. He softened the immediate announcement slightly, clarifying that the order applied specifically to government offices and was not yet universal. This was not a concession, it was a timeline. The full mandate would come later, once the mechanisms for enforcing it were in place. The women in the streets had correctly identified the direction of travel. What they had not yet understood was that the political space for opposing it was closing faster than they could organise. International Women's Day 1979 in Tehran was one of the most significant feminist protests of the 20th century. It is also one of the least discussed outside of Iran, possibly because it fits uncomfortably into narratives that prefer revolutions to be either entirely good or entirely bad. These women were not agents of the Shah. They were not Western plants. They were Iranian women who had just made a revolution and were standing in the street saying, "Not like this, not like this." History did not listen, but they said it anyway. In 1981, it became official. The hijab was no longer a suggestion, a personal choice, or a religious practice left to the individual conscience. It was the law. Women in public spaces were required to cover their hair and wear loose, modest clothing. The punishment for non-compliance ranged from verbal warnings to fines to arrest, and the enforcers, religious morality police, were granted the authority to stop, interrogate, and detain women on the street. Just like that, your morning decision about what to put on your head became a legal matter. Welcome to the Islamic Republic of Iran. You get up in the morning, you get dressed. This has always been a fairly unremarkable part of the day. You choose clothes, you put them on, you leave the house. But in Tehran in 1981, the process now includes an additional step: legal compliance check. Before you walk out your front door, you must confirm that your hair is covered, that your arms are covered to the wrist, that your legs are covered to the ankle, and that your coat or manto is loose enough not to reveal the shape of your body. You must do this regardless of the temperature, regardless of your personal beliefs, regardless of whether you're a devout Muslim who's always dressed this way or a secular woman who has never worn a headscarf in her adult life. The law does not distinguish between these experiences. The law has one setting. The legal framework arrived in stages. The post-revolutionary constitution, adopted in 1979, established the Islamic Republic's foundations. Various decrees and laws in the following years filled in the details. By 1981, mandatory hijab in public was codified, and by 1983 the Islamic Penal Code formalized the punishments. Women caught in violation could be sentenced to lashes, up to 74 in theory, though in practice enforcement was more often fines, detention, and the requirement to sign pledges promising future compliance. The threat of harsher punishment was present enough to function as a structural incentive without being applied in every case. The effects landed very differently depending on who you were. For the millions of Iranian women who had always worn hijab voluntarily, the law changed nothing visible about their daily lives, though many objected to the compulsion on principle. For secular women, for women from religious minorities, for women who had built their professional and personal identities in the space of the previous 2 decades, the law was a redefinition of the public self. You could still exist. You just had to exist differently on terms you had not chosen. What the law created almost immediately was a new form of negotiation. The regulations specified hijab. They did not, at least initially, specify which colour, which precise style, which exact material. Women began testing the edges of compliance with the precision of lawyers and the creativity of people who have decided that if they must operate within a constraint, they will find every inch of space it allows. The headscarf migrated backward. The coat got a belt. The permissible became the political, and the Islamic Republic discovered over the following decades that making a law is considerably easier than making people's relationship to their own bodies comply with it. Before we go further, let's clear something up, because this history is often flattened in ways that aren't fair to anyone. The hijab's mandatory imposition in 1981 was not a return to some eternal, unchanging Iranian tradition. Women's dress in Iran had shifted dramatically across the centuries and in the opposite direction before. In 1936, the Shah's father, Reza Shah, had actually banned the veil entirely, forcing women to appear in public without it. Women who refused to leave their homes rather than be seen unveiled were, in a different era, just as trapped as those who would later be punished for removing the headscarf. Iranian women had been a political football for generations. This is important to sit with. The same garment, the same piece of fabric covering the same hair, had been banned by the state in 1936 and mandated by the state in 1981. In both cases, the woman wearing or not wearing it had not been consulted. In both cases, the decision was made by men in government who had strong opinions about what the sight of a woman's hair communicated about the nation's modernity, morality, and identity. The hijab in Iranian political history has functioned less as a religious symbol and more as a screen onto which governments project their preferred image of Iran. The woman underneath has been almost incidental to the argument. Reza Shah's 1936 ban on veiling was part of his broader project of forced westernization, inspired in part by Ataturk's secularization of Turkey. Police were instructed to physically remove headscarves from women in public spaces. This was not a gentle policy. Women who observed purda, the practice of staying veiled in public, in many cases stopped leaving their homes entirely rather than appear uncovered. The policy was experienced by many religious women not as liberation, but as a form of violence, a state-sanctioned stripping of the covering they considered a religious obligation and a personal dignity. Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, didn't maintain the formal ban, but cultivated a secular public culture in which unveiled women were associated with education and progress, and the veil was implicitly linked to backwardness. This subtext was not subtle. Modern Iranian women did not cover. Traditional ones did. The categories were loaded, the pressure was real, and the women in both categories were being told what their clothes meant by people who were not wearing them. Before Reza Shah, the picture was more varied than any simple narrative suggests. Urban women in Qajar-era Iran wore the chador in public spaces, but dressed elaborately at home and in women's social gatherings that were lively, political and completely invisible to the official historical record because the men writing the record were not invited. Rural practices varied by region, by ethnicity, by economic circumstance. The notion of a single, unified traditional Iranian female dress code has always been more political mythology than historical reality. What you are looking at across the whole arc of this history is a pattern so consistent it becomes almost numbing. Generation after generation of Iranian women whose relationship to their own clothing has been determined primarily by whoever currently controls the state. The specific direction of the imposition changes. The structure of the imposition does not. And the women who keep getting dressed every morning under whatever the current rules happen to be are the constant, patient, exhausted thread running through all of it. Picture this. You're 23, you're running late for work, and your headscarf has slipped back 2 inches too far. A white van pulls up. 2 women in full black chadors step out and inform you that your hair is showing, and you need to come with them. This is not a hypothetical. This is Tuesday in Tehran, 1985. The morality police, mostly women, which added its own layer of grim irony, patrolled the streets checking hemlines, sleeve lengths, the tightness of coats, and the angle of headscarves. Getting stopped could mean a warning, a fine, a trip to the station, or worse. The body, specifically the female body, had become the most contested political territory in the country. You have developed, over the past few years, a specific kind of awareness that did not exist in your life before. It is a peripheral, low-level vigilance, the kind that sits just below conscious thought and never fully switches off. You know where the morality police tend to patrol. You know which streets are safer in the mornings and which intersections they favour in the afternoons. You know that they are more active after certain Friday sermons, more visible during politically sensitive anniversaries, and somewhat more relaxed during the weeks before elections when the government is briefly interested in appearing moderate. You have never been formally taught any of this. You absorbed it the way you absorb all truly important survival information, through the accumulated experiences of every woman you know. The Gashti Irshad, or Guidance Patrol, became the most formalised version of this enforcement in 2005, but the morality police in various forms had been operating since the early 1980s. In the revolutionary years, enforcement was conducted partly by informal comités, revolutionary committees staffed by volunteers with varying degrees of official authorization and highly variable temperaments. Some were relatively lenient, others were not. The lack of standardization was, in its own way, part of the mechanism of control. When the rules are enforced unpredictably, you can never fully relax, which means the psychological pressure is constant even when the physical enforcement is not. The women who staffed the morality patrol were, by most accounts, a mixed group. Some were true believers, convinced that their work served God and community. Some were women who had taken a government job because it was available and paid a salary, which in the context of post-revolutionary Iran was not nothing. Some were reported by women who'd been stopped and detained to be quietly sympathetic, going through required motions with a resigned efficiency that suggested they had their own feelings about the assignment. The institution was not made of monsters. It was made of people following institutional logic, which is in some ways more unsettling. Being stopped was not a neutral experience, even when it ended without arrest. The stop itself was the message. It communicated that your body was subject to review, that a stranger had the legal authority to assess your appearance and find it wanting, that compliance was required not once as an abstract political act, but continuously, every day, every time you left your home. The cumulative weight of this, the daily performance of correct womanhood under the possibility of scrutiny, is something that does not translate easily into policy language, but was experienced in the bodies and nervous systems of millions of women for decades. The white van became a symbol. When it appeared in a street, behaviour changed immediately. Scarves were adjusted, coats were checked, posture shifted. The van didn't need to stop anyone to do its work. Its mere presence reorganised the street around it. That is a remarkably efficient form of social control, and the women of Tehran understood exactly what it was, even as they went on adjusting their scarves and walking to work. Here is something the outside world often doesn't account for when they picture Iranian women under the Islamic Republic. The door, behind closed doors, at home, at private parties, in the apartments of trusted friends, Iranian women wore what they wanted, listened to whatever music they wanted, danced, drank if they chose to, and lived lives that looked almost nothing like what they presented to the street. The double life wasn't a secret. Everybody knew about it. The government knew about it. It was an unofficial, exhausting, permanently precarious arrangement. Perform compliance in public, preserve yourself in private, and it required a level of daily psychological effort that is genuinely hard to overstate. You step inside your friend's apartment on a Friday evening. The door closes behind you, and almost immediately, as if the building itself exhales, the room transforms. Scarves come off. A bottle of something homemade appears from a kitchen cupboard. Music that is certainly not being played on state radio fills the space. Maybe something recorded off a satellite channel. Maybe a foreign album copied onto a thumb drive. Maybe Persian pop produced in Los Angeles and distributed through networks the government officially does not acknowledge exist. People are laughing. People are dressed in clothes that have been waiting in their closets all week for exactly this moment. You've been outside for 8 hours. You've been yourself for approximately 45 seconds. The Iranian concept of Tahof, a system of elaborate social politeness that involves saying things you do not mean as a form of courtesy, is sometimes offered as context for understanding Iranian public life more broadly. There is something to this. Iranian culture had long operated with an understood distance between public presentation and private reality, between what you said in a formal context and what you actually believed. The Islamic Republic did not invent this gap. It industrialized it. The private party became one of the most important social institutions in post-revolutionary Iran. Not the official kind, not the government-sanctioned gathering, but the apartment party, word of mouth only, trusted guests, someone keeping an eye on the stairwell. These parties were where music happened, where dancing happened, where people said what they actually thought about the news, where romances developed in the absence of legal mixed-gender socializing. They were also where people were sometimes raided, arrested, fined, and detained, which added a specific quality of risk to the experience of enjoying yourself. The double life required constant mental bookkeeping. You tracked which version of yourself each person in your life was permitted to see. You maintained different presentations for different contexts, a different vocabulary, a different posture, a different relationship to your own opinions depending on whether you were in a government office, a family gathering, a trusted friend's home, or a stranger's car. The cognitive overhead of this is not abstract. It is tiring in the specific, grinding way that sustained performance is always tiring. What is remarkable is not that people found this exhausting. What is remarkable is how thoroughly they built lives within it anyway. The parties kept happening. The music kept circulating. The conversations kept occurring. The private self, pushed entirely indoors, did not disappear. It adapted, compressed, and found every available crack of space, which is, come to think of it, a fairly precise description of what Iranian women had been doing with their public selves for the entirety of the Republic's existence. In the early 1980s, the Islamic Republic did something that surprised almost everyone, including many of its own supporters. It severely restricted women's access to universities. Dozens of fields of study were declared off-limits for women. The logic, such as it was, held that women's natural role was domestic, and that certain careers, engineering, law, agriculture, were simply inappropriate. Then slowly, over the following decade, most of those restrictions were quietly rolled back. Not because the government had a change of heart exactly, but because the country needed educated workers and the women kept enrolling. By the 1990s, Iranian women were earning more than half of all university degrees, which created a new set of problems that nobody had entirely planned for. You've just been informed that you cannot study veterinary medicine. You are going to study veterinary medicine. You have wanted to study veterinary medicine since you were 11 years old and spent a summer helping your uncle's neighbour with a sick goat. The field has been deemed inappropriate for women, so have agriculture, engineering, and several others. The list is long, the rationale is not detailed, and the administrator delivering the news looks as though he would very much prefer to be somewhere else. You're 20 years old, you have passed your entrance exams, you have a place at a university, and the government has decided that your place does not extend to the subject you chose. The Cultural Revolution of 1980 closed Iranian universities entirely for 2 years, while the government purged faculty, rewrote curricula, and Islamicized the educational system from the inside out. When the universities reopened, the gender restrictions on specific fields were part of the new architecture. They were presented as ideologically coherent. Women belonged in domestic and nurturing roles, and the university system should reflect and reinforce that reality. The restrictions were real, and for the women affected by them, their effects were immediate and concrete. But the restrictions contained a structural problem that became apparent fairly quickly. The Islamic Republic needed doctors, it needed engineers, it needed civil servants and administrators and professionals of all kinds to run an increasingly complex modern state. It also, after 1980, needed them urgently, because it was fighting a major war with Iraq that was consuming enormous quantities of human capital. The female half of the population was not a reserve pool to be ignored. It was a necessity. The rollback was gradual, rarely announced with fanfare, and never framed as an ideological reversal. Fields were quietly reopened, quotas were adjusted. By the late 1980s and through the 1990s, Iranian women were flooding back into universities in numbers that eventually outpaced men. By the mid-2000s, women were earning roughly 65% of university degrees in Iran, a statistic that the government found, to say the least, complicated. It suggested that the women of Iran, given any available opening, would sprint through it. The unintended consequence was a generation of highly educated women facing a labour market and a legal system that had not updated its assumptions to match. Women with engineering degrees who could not easily access the jobs their degrees prepared them for. Women lawyers navigating a court system in which their testimony was legally worth half a man's. The university had admitted them. Everything downstream of the university was still working from a different premise. The gap between what Iranian women were educated to be and what the Republic officially wanted them to be became, over the following decades, one of the central tensions of Iranian society, and one that no amount of enforced headscarves could fully resolve. From 1980 to 1988, Iran fought one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century against Iraq, a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and consumed the country's attention, resources, and grief entirely. While men went to the front, women stepped into roles they had theoretically been excluded from. Factories needed workers, hospitals needed staff, bureaucracies needed people to actually show up and function. The war inadvertently expanded what was practically possible for women in Iranian society, even as the official ideology kept insisting on their domestic primacy. The Republic needed women's labour. It just preferred not to say so out loud. You are a woman in Isfahan in 1982, and your husband left for the front 6 months ago. You have 2 children, a house to maintain, and a factory in your neighbourhood that is making military equipment and is desperately short-staffed. The factory supervisor, a man who, 2 years ago, would have told you that women belong at home, is now at your door asking if you would consider a position on the production floor. You consider it. You take it. You discover that you are good at it. You also discover that the official ideology of the Islamic Republic and the actual operational requirements of the Islamic Republic are not always the same document. The Iran-Iraq War began in September 1980, when Saddam Hussein's forces invaded, and it did not end until 1988, 8 years of trench warfare, chemical weapons, child soldiers, and a casualty count that conservative estimates put at several 100,000 Iranians dead and many more wounded. It was a national catastrophe on a scale that reorganized everything. The government's entire ideological and administrative attention tilted toward the war effort, which had a paradoxical effect on domestic gender politics. Enforcing the finer points of women's social restriction became a lower priority when the country was bleeding. In hospitals, women worked as nurses, administrators, and eventually doctors in numbers that would have been restricted in peacetime. The need for medical personnel simply overrode the ideological hesitations. Women managed family businesses when the men who had run them were dead or at the front. Women took on agricultural labour in villages depleted of male workers. In cities, women ran offices, staffed government ministries, and kept the administrative machinery of the state functioning throughout 8 years of war. The wartime martyrdom culture also created something unexpected for women, a form of public moral authority. The mother of a martyr, a woman who had given her son to the revolution's war, occupied a position of genuine social respect that cut across the normal hierarchy. These women were not quiet. They attended funerals, they spoke at commemorations, they were featured in state media. The official ideology said women were domestic and secondary. The war kept producing women who were none of those things, and who were impossible to quietly sideline. When the war ended in 1988, there was no formal reckoning with what had happened to gender roles during it. The government did not announce that the experience of 8 years had demonstrated something about women's capabilities. It simply moved on. But the women who had spent 8 years running things did not forget that they had run them. The practical expansion of what was possible had occurred. Whether the Republic acknowledged it or not was in the long run a secondary question. In the 1980s, the easiest way to signal that you were not entirely on board with the Islamic Republic's vision of womanhood was to wear nail polish in a shade that was clearly not neutral. It sounds absurd until you understand the logic. When the entire surface of your body is legally regulated, the only form of self-expression left is in the details. Women pushed the permitted headscarf back by a centimetre. They wore it in brighter colours. They let strands of hair escape. They wore lipstick, then brighter lipstick, then lipstick that practically dared someone to say something. Resistance, when large-scale protest is dangerous, finds the smallest possible apertures and pours through them. Think about what it means to choose a colour when colour is political. You're standing in front of a small selection of permitted cosmetics because cosmetics were never fully banned, only certain expressions of them, and you are selecting a lipstick. The decision is, on its surface, about lipstick. It is also, simultaneously, a calibrated assessment of how much risk you are willing to absorb today, how visible you want to be, how much you feel like having a conversation with a morality police officer about the precise line between permissible grooming and un-Islamic display. You pick the darker red. You have picked it before. You will pick it again tomorrow. The regime's relationship with cosmetics and fashion was never fully resolved into a clean legal framework, which meant the edges were always being negotiated in real time. The official position was that women should dress modestly and avoid adornment that attracted attention or sexual interest. The practical application of this was inconsistent. Different enforcers, different neighbourhoods, different political climates producing different tolerances. Women became exp. Readers of the enforcement environment, adjusting their presentation the way sailors adjust to wind, constantly, automatically, without needing to make a conscious decision each time. The fashion negotiation became increasingly elaborate over the decades. By the 1990s, the manteau, the required loose overcoat, was being tailored in ways that the original regulation writers had presumably not anticipated. Belted, fitted at the shoulder, made from fabrics that were technically opaque but somehow extremely elegant. The headscarf required to cover the hair was worn in every colour and pattern imaginable, pushed progressively further back on the head until it was performing compliance in the most technical sense available, while communicating something entirely different. The government issued periodic crackdowns. The fashion moved around the crackdowns like water around rocks. Nail polish deserves its own moment of appreciation in this history. The regulations on nail polish were genuinely unclear. It was required to be removed for prayer, which some interpreted as meaning it was generally impermissible, and others interpreted as meaning it was fine outside prayer contexts. Women wore it. They were told to remove it. They wore it again. A deep red manicure in a Tehran office in 1987 was a small, entirely deniable act of continuing to be a person with aesthetic preferences, which in the context of a state that had tried to regulate personhood down to the centimetre was not nothing. The cumulative effect of millions of small individual decisions to push the headscarf back another centimetre, to choose the brighter colour, to wear the lipstick, was not revolution in any immediate sense. But it was the continuous low-level maintenance of a self that refused to be entirely absorbed into the state's preferred image. It was the daily, unremarkable, absolutely exhausting work of remaining underneath everything yourself. By the mid-1990s, a new generation had grown up entirely inside the Islamic Republic, and they were not entirely what the founders had ordered. In 1997, Muhammad Khatami, a reformist cleric with an unexpectedly charming manner and views that sounded almost moderate, won the presidential election by a landslide. Young Iranians, and especially young women, had voted for him in enormous numbers. For a few years, it felt like something might actually shift. The press got slightly freer. Social restrictions relaxed in small but visible ways. Women's rights advocates got slightly more room to manoeuvre. Then the hardliners pushed back, and the window narrowed again, as windows in Iranian politics reliably do. You are 19 in 1997, and you have just voted for the first time. You voted for Khatami. Most of your friends voted for Khatami. Your mother, who remembers 1979 with a complicated mixture of hope and grief, voted for Khatami with slightly more caution than you did, because she has seen what happens to Iranian hope when it gets too comfortable. But even she is cautiously optimistic in a way she's not been for years. The margin of Khatami's victory, 69% of the vote, with a turnout that included enormous numbers of young people and women who had not previously bothered, has stunned the hardliners and briefly scrambled the normal logic of Iranian political life. Khatami's presidency from 1997 to 2005 was the most significant experiment in political reform the Islamic Republic had yet attempted from within. He spoke about civil society, about the rule of law, about the rights of citizens within an Islamic framework. Newspapers proliferated. Student organizations became more active. Public debate about previously forbidden topics, the limits of clerical authority, women's legal status, the relationship between Islam and democracy, entered the mainstream press in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. For women's rights activists, it was a period of genuine, if partial, opening. The 1 million signatures campaign, which collected petitions demanding legal reforms to discriminatory laws, gathered momentum in the Khatami years. Women's NGOs expanded. Female journalists filled the pages of reform-era newspapers with coverage of domestic violence, reproductive rights, and legal discrimination that had never previously appeared in the Iranian press. The conversation was happening in public in Iran, not just in exile or in whispers, for the first time in the Republic's history. But the Islamic Republic's constitution had been designed with exactly this situation in mind. The Guardian Council, 12 religious jurists with veto power over legislation, could and did strike down reform legislation. The judiciary, controlled by hardliners, prosecuted reformist journalists and shut reformist newspapers. Student protesters were arrested. By Khatami's second term, the pattern was clear. The reformists could win elections, but the structural mechanisms of the state were held by people who had no intention of reforming anything. What the Khatami years demonstrated was both the depth of Iranian popular demand for change and the resilience of the system designed to prevent it. Millions of Iranians had expressed, through legitimate electoral participation, a clear desire for a different kind of republic. The Republic had noted this preference and largely declined to act on it. The window closed, the newspapers were shut, the activists went to prison. And a generation of Iranians who had briefly, genuinely believed that change was possible through the system began revising their assessment of the system. In 2009, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was declared the winner of a presidential election that very large numbers of Iranians believed had been stolen, the streets exploded. The Green Movement brought millions of people out into the open in the largest protest Iran had seen since 1979, and women were everywhere in it, photographed at the front of marches, arguing with riot police, bleeding on the street after being beaten. One image defined it: Neda Aga Sultan, a 26-year-old woman shot during a protest, dying on camera, her face broadcast around the world within hours. She became the face of the movement. The regime crushed the protests, but the image stayed. You're standing in Azadi Square in June 2009, and there are so many people around you that you cannot see where the crowd ends. The colour green is everywhere. Green wristbands, green scarves, green paint on faces and hands. The government has declared the election result, and the result does not match anything that anyone you know has experienced on the ground. The sense of being lied to, clearly, brazenly, without apology, has produced something in the crowd that is beyond ordinary political anger. It is personal. It is the feeling of being treated as someone whose experience does not count, whose perception can be overridden by official announcement. The crowd around you has decided collectively that it disagrees. The 2009 election and the protest that followed it were a turning point in how the Islamic Republic related to its own population. The official story was that Ahmadinejad had won with 62% of the vote, a result announced with suspicious speed and defended with increasing aggression as the protests began. The protests began anyway, quietly at first, then in numbers that filled the largest public spaces in Tehran. For several weeks, Iranian cities saw daily demonstrations on a scale that had not occurred since the revolution itself. Women's participation in the Green Movement was not incidental. It was central, visible, and documented. women were among the most prominent voices in the movement's intellectual leadership. Female bloggers and journalists had been building digital networks for years that now served as the nervous system of a protest movement in a country where state media was useless and international journalists were being expelled. Women organised, documented and transmitted the movement's history in real time on platforms that the government was simultaneously trying to block. Nida Aga Sultan was shot on June 20th, 2009, standing near a protest she had joined after her car became stuck in traffic. She was not a political activist. She was a music student. The video of her death, filmed on a phone and uploaded within hours, was seen by millions of people around the world before the Iranian government had time to manage the narrative. Her face, eyes open, blood spreading across her face in a pattern that looked almost designed for symbolic impact, became the image of the Green Movement and of something larger. The cost of saying no to the Islamic Republic in the street. The movement was crushed with arrests, beatings, torture and executions. Its leaders were imprisoned, placed under house arrest or forced into exile. The green wristbands disappeared from Tehran streets. But the movement had demonstrated something that could not be undisputed. Millions of Iranians had been willing to stand in the street at real physical risk to say that they wanted a different country. The Islamic Republic had suppressed the movement. It had not answered the question. Here is an irony so dense you could build a bridge with it. One of the stated purposes of mandatory modest dress was to remove the supposed source of sexual distraction from public life, thereby making public spaces safer and more appropriate for women to inhabit, which meant technically that women could now go anywhere. A woman in full hijab was, by the government's own logic, properly covered and therefore permissible in any public space, and Iranian women, being neither naive nor slow, used exactly that logic to go everywhere into offices, universities, government buildings, markets and professions that previous generations hadn't accessed. The hijab that was meant to keep women contained became, among other things, their entry ticket. Let's follow the logic together, because it is genuinely spectacular. The pre-revolutionary objection from religious conservatives to women in public life had often centred on the argument that mixed-gender public spaces were morally inappropriate, that the presence of unveiled women created fitna, social disorder, temptation. The solution proposed and eventually imposed was mandatory modest dress, which would resolve the problem by ensuring that women in public were appropriately covered. The unexamined assumption embedded in this logic was that once women were covered, their presence in public spaces became unproblematic. This assumption turned out to have significant practical consequences that the framers did not fully anticipate. A woman in proper hijab, by the Islamic Republic's own framework, had fulfilled her obligation. She was modestly dressed. She was therefore not a source of the disorder that her undressed presence would theoretically cause. She could, in principle, be anywhere, in the street, in the office, in the university lecture hall, in the government ministry, in the hospital, in the courtroom. The covering that was meant to signal her domestic nature had simultaneously removed one of the primary arguments for excluding her from public life. Iranian women used this logic with the systematic thoroughness of people who have been handed a tool and intend to use it fully. They entered the workforce in numbers that grew steadily through the 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s. They went to university and didn't leave. They entered professions, medicine, pharmacy, journalism, academia, that their mothers had navigated in the previous era without hijab, but that they navigated with it, producing no obvious reduction in their competence or ambition. The hijab travelled with them everywhere they went, which meant everywhere they went was somewhere a hijab had been. By the 2000s, the Islamic Republic found itself in the position of having to explain why the women it had mandated into modest dress were now inconveniently present in every sector of public life, in numbers that its gender ideology had not budgeted for. various attempts were made to restrict women in specific fields, to require gender-segregated workplaces, to frame certain professions as incompatible with Islamic femininity. These attempts met with uneven success, partly because the economy needed the workers, partly because the women had degrees and legal standing and were not easily moved. The hijab remains mandatory. The women who wear it are, by almost every measurable indicator, the most educated and publicly active female population in the region. The Islamic Republic created both of these facts. It finds them, as a combination, genuinely difficult to manage. This is the kind of irony that history produces when ideology meets the irreducible stubbornness of actual human beings deciding what to do with their lives. Let's be honest about something that gets lost in Western retellings of this history. Not every Iranian woman wanted to take off the headscarf. Before 1979, secular educated women in Tehran wore miniskirts. Yes, but they were a fraction of the country. Millions of Iranian women, from religious families, from traditional backgrounds, from rural areas, had always worn the hijab voluntarily and continued to after the revolution without grief. The problem was never the hijab itself. The problem was the word mandatory. The removal of choice in both directions across the century was the injury, and conflating religious practice with political coercion does disservice to both. You're a woman in Mashhad in 1975, you have worn hijab your entire adult life. You wear it because your faith calls you to, because your mother wore it, because it is part of how you understand your own dignity and your relationship to God. You are not oppressed by it. You are not performing it under duress. It is yours, in the way that deeply personal religious practices are yours, not imposed from outside but emerging from the inside of a faith that you hold genuinely and without apology. You have watched the Shah's Iran treat women like you as background furniture in a modernization project designed by and for a secular urban elite that does not know your name. The hijab, in Iran and globally, carries a range of meanings that Western discourse consistently flattens into one. For some women, it's a religious obligation, a form of worship expressed through the body. For some, it's a cultural identity, a connection to family and heritage. For some, it's a political statement, a conscious refusal of Western beauty standards and the male gaze. For some, it is all of these simultaneously. For some, it is none of them, just a garment, in the same uncomplicated way that a hat is just a hat, worn out of habit or convenience or community belonging without deep ideological content. The revolution of 1979 drew genuine support from millions of religious Iranian women who had felt marginalized, condescended to, and culturally erased by the Shah's secular modernity project. When Reza Shah banned the veil in 1936, religious women who refused to appear unveiled simply stopped leaving their homes, a confinement that lasted years. Their daughters and granddaughters remembered. The Shah's Iran had not been neutral on the question of religious female identity. It had simply been discriminatory in the other direction. This is not an argument for the mandatory hijab. It is an argument for the complexity of the people living under it. The image of Iranian women as a uniformly secular population yearning to remove the headscarf is as much a political projection as the image the Islamic Republic promotes of Iranian women as uniformly devout and content. Both flatten an enormous range of actual human experience into a convenient narrative. The reality contains women who resent the law, women who would follow its requirements regardless of the law, and every possible position in between. What the mandatory hijab did to religious women who had always chosen to wear it was, among other things, transform their personal religious practice into a government enforcement program. Their hijab, which had been theirs, became the state's. It was now worn in compliance with law rather than an expression of faith, which changed its meaning whether they wanted it to or not. The thing they had chosen was no longer something they could choose. The state had moved into the space of their devotion and planted its flag. This too was a loss. It just rarely appears in the headlines. In September 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. 3 days later, she was dead. The government said she had a heart attack. Her family and virtually everyone who investigated said she had been beaten. The protests that followed were unlike anything Iran had seen in decades, and the slogan that emerged, "Woman, Life, Freedom," became a rallying cry that crossed every ethnic and class line in the country. Women took off their headscarves in the street. They burned them. They cut their hair in public. The world watched. You're watching a video on your phone. It was filmed in a hospital corridor and it is circulating faster than the government can block it. In the video, a young woman lies motionless. Her name is Mahsa Amini. She'd been visiting Tehran from her home city of Sarkez in Kurdistan province. She'd been stopped by the morality police. She'd been taken to a detention centre for, in the official language, education and guidance regarding her dress. She'd arrived at the hospital in a coma. She would not regain consciousness. The government's account of what happened, a pre-existing heart condition, a natural medical event, nothing to do with the detention, is contradicted by her family, by witnesses, by medical professionals who reviewed the available information, and by the fact that she was 22 years old and had no documented heart condition. The protest began within hours of her death on September 16th, 2022, and spread within days to cities across Iran. They were different in character from previous Iranian protest movements in ways that mattered. The Green Movement of 2009 had been largely urban, largely middle class, and organised around a specific electoral grievance. The 2022 uprising crossed ethnic, class and geographic lines that had not previously aligned. Kurdish communities, Baluch communities, Arab-Iranian communities, the urban youth of Tehran, the students of provincial universities, all in the streets, all chanting the same slogan. Women cutting their hair in public became the defining image. It was an act with deep cultural resonance. Hair as identity, as inheritance, as the specific thing the state had decided to regulate, and it was performed openly, on camera, by women who understood they were being filmed and chose to be seen anyway. The videos travelled around the world in hours. For many international observers, something about this specific act, so personal, so deliberate, so irreversible, communicated the stakes of the protest more vividly than any policy document could. The government's response was brutal and familiar. Arrests, internet blackouts, live fire, executions. Hundreds were killed. Thousands were arrested. The executions of protesters, carried out with the speed of a government that understands the value of early deterrence, were condemned internationally and produced further protest domestically. The machinery that had crushed the Green Movement was deployed again, with refinements. The protests were suppressed. Whether they were defeated is a different question. The slogan had named something that previous uprisings had approached but not stated so directly. That the question of women's bodies, women's choices, and women's freedom was not a secondary issue to be addressed after other political reforms. It was the central issue. It was the country. Mahsa Amini had been stopped for 2 inches of hair. What followed was 40 years of accounting, arriving all at once. The morality police, formerly called the Gashti Irshad, or Guidance Patrol, were established in 2005 and became one of the most visible and resented symbols of state control over women's bodies. Their job was to enforce Islamic dress codes in public spaces, which in practice meant stopping women, checking that their hijabs were properly positioned, inspecting the length of their coats, and detaining those deemed non-compliant. They travelled in white vans. They were often young, sometimes roughly the same age as the women they stopped. The whole apparatus was, in its own way, an almost bureaucratically banal form of humiliation, staffed by ordinary people, following rules written by other ordinary people, all agreeing not to say too loudly how strange it was. You're 24 years old, and you have just been hired for a government job. The job is with the Gashti Ershad. You are a woman. You will be stopping other women. The pay is modest but reliable, which in post-sanctions Tehran is not a trivial consideration. Your training covers the relevant regulations. What constitutes proper hijab, what violations look like, how to approach a non-compliant woman on the street, how to process a detention. The training does not cover what to do if the woman you stop starts crying or argues back with the specific, exhausted fury of someone who has been stopped 14 times before or turns out to be someone's mother running late to a hospital appointment. You will figure those parts out as you go, in the white van, on the street, in the daily accumulating weight of a job that nobody talks about at social gatherings, without a specific kind of silence falling over the table. The establishment of the Gashti Ershad as a formal, uniformed patrol in 2005 under President Ahmadinejad represented a hardening of enforcement that had previously been more informal. Revolutionary committees had handled this function in the early 1980s. Neighbourhood comités had operated with varying intensity through the following decades, and periodic crackdowns had been launched and relaxed according to political weather. The Guidance Patrol institutionalised what had previously been ad hoc, giving it uniforms, vehicles, official procedures, and a budget. The patrol was predominantly staffed by women, which served an obvious operational logic. Women could physically interact with female detainees in ways that male officers could not under Islamic law, but created its own ideological complexity. The women enforcing the hijab requirement were themselves subject to it. They wore hijab to work. Some wore it because they believed in it. Some wore it because it was the uniform. The line between personal religious practice and professional obligation was, in their case, officially indistinguishable. Accounts from women who had attained vary enormously. Some describe relatively routine encounters, a warning, a brief lecture, a signature on a form promising future compliance, release within an hour. Others describe detention centres where women were held for hours or days, subjected to lectures from religious supervisors, pressured to call male family members to come collect them as though they were errant children, rather than adults who had left the house wearing the wrong angle of fabric. The range of experience reflects the range of individual officers, supervisors and facilities, the inconsistency itself functioning as a form of ambient anxiety, because you never knew in advance which version you were about to encounter. The Gashtiye Ershad was suspended following the 2022 protests, an acknowledgement from the government that the patrol had become a liability too visible and too hated to continue operating in its existing form. The suspension was not accompanied by any repeal of the underlying law. The requirement remained. The enforcement mechanism had simply been temporarily retired, the way you might put a particularly unpopular piece of furniture in storage rather than throw it away, on the understanding that you might want it back and that the house still belongs to you. If you want to understand the history of the Islamic Republic's confidence levels at any given moment, you don't need to read policy documents. You need to look at what women were wearing on the streets of Tehran. In the early 1980s, full black shadows were the norm. The fear of punishment was real, and the streets looked uniform. By the late 1990s, brighter colours had crept back in. By the 2000s, headscarves had migrated to the back of the head, coats were belted at the waist, and jeans appeared underneath everything. Each shift was a quiet negotiation, a probe to see how far the line had moved. Iranian women's fashion has functioned for decades as a real-time political barometer. Think of it as a 40-year graph with no labelled axes. In the early 1980s, the data points cluster tight and dark. Black shadows, dark manto, scarves pulled firmly forward to the hairline. The enforcement is new and unpredictable, and the consequences of non-compliance are genuinely frightening, so compliance is nearly total in its visible forms. The streets have a uniformity that photographs from the period capture with an almost surreal completeness. A city of millions of women, all dressed within the same narrow band of acceptable presentation, all performing the same required external self. If the graph could record anxiety, it would be spiking. Move forward a decade. The war has ended. The worst of the early revolutionary fervour has cooled into the more routine authoritarianism of an established state. The data points begin to spread. Colours appear: navy, dark green, burgundy, then eventually brown, then eventually anything. The scarf is still on the head, but it is no longer necessarily at the front of the head. Strands of hair are visible at the temples. The manteau still required is being cut by tailors who have quietly developed an expertise in extracting every permitted centimetre of shape from a garment whose regulations specify looseness, but do not specify exactly how loose. By the mid-2000s, the fashion vocabulary of Tehran streets has become genuinely elaborate. The technically compliant headscarf sits at the crown of the head, securing approximately 40% of the hair it is theoretically covering, the remainder falling freely below it. The required coat has been belt-cinched, shoulder-tailored, and produced in fabrics that are opaque in the technical sense while being clearly intended to suggest the outline of a body underneath. Skinny jeans appear below the hemline, heeled boots, manicured hands, full makeup applied in the car on the way to work, touching up in the lift on the way to the office. The government issued periodic crackdowns with a regularity that became almost seasonal, usually in spring, when the weather warmed and the clothes lightened, and again in the run-up to politically sensitive dates. The crackdowns produced temporary retreats in the fashion graph, then gradual recovery, then further advance. The line kept moving. The enforcement kept chasing it. Neither ever quite caught the other. What this decades-long negotiation documents, more precisely than any political survey could, is the continuous, distributed, entirely uncoordinated collective will of millions of women to remain people with aesthetic preferences and individual identities within a system designed to produce a uniform public surface. They were not all making a political statement. Some of them just liked the colour yellow. But the cumulative effect of all those individual choices, the yellow scarf, the belted coat, the red nail polish, was a political statement whether it was intended as one or not. The clothes kept a record, the official archives did not. While state television broadcast programs about proper Islamic womanhood, Iranian homes were quietly full of satellite dishes pointed at foreign channels and shelves full of smuggled DVDs. Turkish soap operas became enormously popular. American movies circulated on copied discs. The internet, once it arrived, became both a lifeline and a surveillance tool simultaneously. Young Iranian women who had never left the country watched the same shows, followed the same influences, and absorbed the same pop culture as young women in Istanbul or London or Los Angeles, and then stepped outside and put their hijab on to walk to the shop. The gap between the inside world and the outside world was, for some, almost cosmically wide. The satellite dish was illegal. It was also, by the mid-1990s, present on approximately half the rooftops in Tehran. The government periodically announced crackdowns, dispatched officers to confiscate dishes, and issued statements about the corrupting influence of foreign media. The dishes were taken down when the officers appeared and reinstalled, often within hours when they left. This became one of the defining rhythms of Iranian urban life, a slow, repetitive, completely unresolvable argument between a government that wanted to control the information environment and a population that had decided with quiet collective firmness that it did not consent to that control. Turkish soap operas require a specific mention because their popularity in Iran was so enormous and so culturally significant that it genuinely unsettled the authorities. Shows like Gümüş and later Dirilish, Ertuğrul attracted Iranian audiences in the tens of millions. The appeal was partly aesthetic, high production values, attractive actors, compelling storylines, and partly something more specific. Turkish dramas showed Muslim characters living Muslim lives that looked nothing like the Islamic Republic's approved template. Women in headscarves who also had romantic lives, professional ambitions, complex interior worlds, and wardrobes that suggested individual personality. The implicit argument was devastating. Islam and individual female selfhood were not incompatible. The Islamic Republic had not invented the only possible version of Muslim womanhood. The DVD underground operated with the casual efficiency of a well-established informal economy. Films and television series, American, European, Persian language productions from the Los Angeles diaspora, Bollywood, Korean dramas, circulated on copied discs sold from the back of shops, delivered by motorcycle couriers, passed between colleagues at work wrapped in newspaper. The quality varied. The selection was comprehensive. You could watch something released in American cinemas 3 months earlier in your Tehran living room, with Persian subtitles added by a volunteer translator somewhere in the network while eating dinner. When the internet arrived and then smartphones, the information environment expanded into something entirely beyond the government's capacity to manage, despite genuinely determined efforts. VPNs became so standard that older Iranians learned to use them without fully understanding the technology, the way previous generations had learned to work the satellite dish without understanding satellite mechanics. Instagram, before it was blocked, had an Iranian user base that was among the most active in the world. Telegram became the organizing tool of protest movements. The government's internet filtering apparatus, among the most sophisticated outside China, kept blocking, and the population kept routing around the blocks. The result was a generation of Iranian women simultaneously among the most surveilled and most globally connected in the world. They lived inside one of the strictest information control regimes on Earth, while watching the same YouTube videos as their peers in Berlin. The gap this produced between the world they could see and the world they were permitted to inhabit was not abstract. It was a daily, specific, personally felt experience of being told that your reality was smaller than you knew it to be. For decades after the revolution, women were banned from attending male sporting events in Iran, specifically football matches. The logic was that the atmosphere was unseemly and that the language men used at football games was inappropriate for women to hear. Iranian women, who apparently had not been warned that they lacked the emotional fortitude to handle stadium profanity, found this policy both insulting and infuriating. A small movement of women began showing up in disguise, in wigs, in men's clothes to sneak into games. One of them, Shah was arrested in 2019 and set herself on fire outside the courthouse. She died 3 days later. She became known as the Blue Girl. In 2022, women were officially permitted to attend matches. You love football. This is not a complicated or ideologically charged statement. You have loved football since you were 7 years old and watched your father watch matches on a television set in the corner of the living room, the crowd noise filling the apartment, the tension of a penalty shootout making him stand up from his chair without noticing he was standing. You grew up knowing the rosters, the statistics, the history, the specific heartbreak of supporting a team that regularly produces specific heartbreak. You are an expert. You're also, under the laws of the Islamic Republic, not permitted to attend a match in a stadium. The reason given is that the language in stadiums is too coarse for women. You've heard coarse language. You've survived it. Nobody asked your opinion. The ban on women attending football matches was one of the most internationally visible manifestations of the Islamic Republic's gender restrictions, partly because football is universally legible, and partly because the absurdity of the specific justification protecting women from bad words was difficult to defend with a straight face on any platform. FIFA, the international football governing body, made periodic noises about requiring Iran to admit women to stadiums as a condition of international participation. The Iranian government made periodic adjustments that fell just short of actual compliance. Women who attempted to attend matches in disguise were sometimes arrested, sometimes allowed through, sometimes turned away at the gate. The inconsistency was by now a familiar feature. Enforcement was porous enough to suggest the ban was not entirely absolute, but firm enough to communicate that the right to sit in a stadium and watch football was conditional on government mood rather than any stable legal principle. Shah Kodayari had been arrested trying to attend a match wearing a wig and men's clothing. She faced a potential prison sentence. When she set herself on fire outside the courthouse in March 2019 and died from her burns 3 days later, she was 29 years old. The outcry, both domestically and internationally, was significant enough to accelerate the negotiations between FIFA and Iranian authorities that eventually produced, in 2022, the official permission for women to attend football matches. Women entered the Azadi stadium, Azadi meaning freedom in Persian, legally for the first time in over 40 years. The moment was filmed, photographed and circulated widely. Women in the stands cheering, wearing blue. The stadium whose name meant freedom had for 4 decades been a place they were not permitted to enter. They were there now, officially, provisionally, under conditions that could theoretically be reversed. But they were there. The blue girl had not lived to see it. Her name was chanted in the stands by women who had. Since 1979, Iran has experienced one of the largest sustained emigrations of educated women in the world. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, academics. The list of Iranian women who left the country, whether after the revolution or in subsequent waves, reads like the index of a lost university. Some left immediately in 1979. Others left after the war. Others left after the crackdowns on the reform movement, or after 2009 or after 2022. Each departure was a loss the country absorbed and rarely acknowledged. The diaspora built careers, raised families, and created a second Iran scattered across Los Angeles, Toronto, London, Stockholm and Sydney, always watching, always connected, never quite fully elsewhere. You pack a suitcase in Tehran in 1980. You're a gynecologist. You completed your training at the University of Tehran. You have a practice, patients who trust you, colleagues you have worked alongside for years. You have also, in the past 12 months, watched the university purge faculty members who asked the wrong questions, watched colleagues arrested for political affiliations that were never secret but were only now being treated as crimes, watched the professional and personal landscape of your life reorganize itself around a logic you do not recognize and did not vote for. You pack the suitcase, you take the degree certificates, you go. You tell yourself it is temporary. Most people who leave tell themselves it is temporary. The first wave of emigration after 1979 was rapid and enormous. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 4 million Iranians left in the years immediately following the revolution. Professionals, members of the secular middle and upper classes, religious minorities, former government officials, and anyone whose previous associations made their position in the new order precarious. Women with education and careers were overrepresented in this group, partly because they had the most to lose in a system that was actively restricting professional female life, and partly because they had the international networks and qualifications that made departure possible. Subsequent waves followed every major political crisis. After the war, after the 1999 student protests, after the 2009 Green Movement crackdown, after 2022. Each wave had a slightly different demographic composition and a slightly different character, but the underlying dynamic was consistent. A system that could not accommodate the ambitions and expectations of its most educated citizens kept producing people who decided the accommodation was not coming and left to find it elsewhere. Los Angeles developed the largest Iranian diaspora community outside Iran itself, a city within a city in the San Fernando Valley, complete with Persian-language television channels, newspapers, restaurants, and cultural institutions that maintained a version of pre-revolutionary Iranian culture in amber, while the country itself moved on. Toronto, London, Stockholm, Sydney, Dubai, each city accumulated its Iranian layer, its community of people who were technically elsewhere but remained. Through satellite television and phone calls and the particular grief of people who left something they loved, continuously present in the place they had departed. The cost to Iran is almost impossible to calculate cleanly, but it is real. Every doctor who left was a doctor Iran did not have. Every engineer, every academic, every artist, every lawyer. The Islamic Republic inherited one of the most educated female populations in the developing world, and spent the following decades watching significant portions of it leave. The women who stayed built careers and lives and fought from within for incremental change. The women who left built careers and lives and watched from outside, sending money, sending information, sending solidarity. Both choices were made under pressure. Neither was made lightly. And the country that produced both populations has never fully reckoned with what the departure of so many of its daughters actually meant. By the 1990s, the children of the revolution had grown up. They had never known the Shah, never worn a miniskirt, never gone to a discotheque. They had been raised inside the Islamic Republic's version of normal, and somehow they were not especially grateful for it. Young women in 1990s Tehran were, by many accounts, among the most educated, most politically informed, and most quietly furious generations the country had produced. They had watched their mothers navigate the transformation. They'd grown up under rules that nobody around them entirely believed in, and they were, slowly, methodically, and with extraordinary creativity, pushing back on every front that was available to them. You are 17 in 1993, and the Islamic Republic is the only country you have ever known. You have no personal memory of miniskirts or discotheques. You have no nostalgic relationship to the Shah's Iran because you were not there. What you have instead is an extremely precise awareness of the gap between what you are told and what is true, because you grew up in a society where that gap was one of the primary educational experiences available to children paying attention. You watched your parents perform one thing in public and be another thing at home. You watched teachers at school deliver a curriculum they sometimes visibly did not believe. You learned, early and thoroughly, to maintain your own interior life as a separate project from your official exterior one. You're 17, and you're already an expert at living in two registers simultaneously. The generation that came of age in the 1990s had grown up with the Iran-Iraq War as their childhood background noise, rationing, air raid sirens, the specific vocabulary of a society organized around military sacrifice. The war ended in 1988 when many of them were small children, and what followed was a period of reconstruction that was supposed to translate revolutionary sacrifice into material improvement. The reconstruction was real in some ways and deeply inadequate in others. What it could not deliver was an explanation of why the rules that governed young people's lives were what they were, why the music they liked was illegal, why the friendships they wanted to have required elaborate concealment, why the political reality of their country was so obviously at odds with any version of it they had constructed in their own minds. Young women of this generation were, statistically, flooding universities. They were reading everything they could access, the Reform-era press, Samizdat literature, whatever circulated through informal networks. They were having conversations in private that were generations ahead of the official public discourse. They were also watching the limited openings of the Khatami years with the specific alertness of people who had learned not to trust openings, because every previous opening had eventually closed. What distinguished this generation from their mothers was not necessarily greater courage or greater radicalism. It was a different relationship to the Republic's legitimacy. Their mothers had lived through the revolution and carried with them some memory of having chosen it, or at least of understanding why it had happened. The daughters had been handed the result without the choice. The Republic was simply there when they arrived, a set of rules they had not agreed to, justified by a revolution they had not made. The gap between the country they had been given and the country they believed they deserved was not a source of nostalgia. It was a source of specific, forward-looking anger, and it was building. Under the Islamic Republic, direct criticism of the government was dangerous, but Iranian artists and writers found that you could say almost anything if you said it sideways. Cinema became one of the most remarkable forms of resistance. Iranian filmmakers, working under censorship, produced some of the most praised films in the world by learning to imply what they could not state. Women directors emerged and made films about women's lives with a precision and intimacy that bypassed the censors because it looked, on the surface, quiet. Poetry, which had been central to Iranian culture, for 1,000 years became a coded language for saying things that couldn't be said plainly. The revolution tried to control speech. It accidentally made metaphor a superpower. You're a filmmaker in Tehran in the early 1990s. Everything you want to say is technically illegal. Not illegal in a list somewhere that you could consult, but illegal in the more ambient and arguably more efficient way of a system where the consequences of saying the wrong thing are real enough that the wrong thing defines itself by the silence around it. You want to make a film about a woman who is unhappy with her marriage and the legal impossibility of leaving it. You cannot make this film. You can make a film about a woman who is looking for something she has lost, who walks through a city that does not quite see her, who arrives at the end of the journey changed in a way the camera registers but never explicitly names. You make this film. It wins awards at Cannes. The censors who reviewed it and found no direct violation of anything are not entirely certain what happened. Iranian cinema after the revolution became one of the most internationally acclaimed film traditions of the late 20th century, a result that was almost entirely unintended by the Islamic Republic, which had hoped to use cinema as a tool of ideological promotion, and instead produced a generation of filmmakers who became world famous precisely because the constraints imposed on them had forced an extraordinary formal sophistication. Abbas Kiarostami, Mohsen Makhmalbaf, Jafar Panahi, Samira Makhmalbaf, Rakshan Bani Etemad. The list of Iranian filmmakers celebrated at major international festivals through the 1990s and 2000s is long, and the films share a quality of implication, of meaning generated through what is withheld rather than what is stated, that is directly legible as the aesthetic consequence of censorship. Women filmmakers occupied a specific position in this landscape. The requirement that women on screen be fully covered, no physical contact with male actors, no depiction of domestic settings without hijab, no scenes that would be unremarkable in any cinema elsewhere, forced narrative strategies that ended up being formally interesting in ways the rules had not intended. A film about women's interior lives that could not show a bedroom without a headscarf became a film about what happens in the spaces between rooms, in the street, in the glances between people who cannot touch. The constraint produced the art. Poetry had an even longer tradition of political implication in Iranian culture, a tradition stretching back centuries through Hafez and Rumi, and a long lineage of poets who had learned to encode what could not be said directly in the language of wine and the beloved and the garden. Post-revolutionary poets worked within and against this tradition. using its established vocabulary of concealment to say things about the present that the present would not permit to be said plainly. The government could ban a pamphlet, it could not ban Hafez. And if a new poem sounded like Hafez while clearly being about something else entirely, the space between the surface and the meaning was where the conversation happened. In 2003, Shirin Ebadi became the first Iranian and first Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She was a human rights lawyer who had been stripped of her judgeship after the revolution because the Islamic Republic had determined that women were not emotionally suited for judicial roles, and had continued practicing law anyway, defending political prisoners, journalists, and women's rights activists in the very courts that had been built to silence them. She didn't leave Iran. She didn't stop working. She used the legal system's own language to argue against its practices, which drove the authorities absolutely mad. Her Nobel was announced while she was in Paris. She went straight back to Tehran. You're a lawyer, and you have just been told that you can no longer be a judge. The year is 1979. You have been a judge. You are good at being a judge. The new government has determined that women lack the necessary emotional stability for judicial decision-making. This is the actual stated reasoning, delivered without apparent irony, and has accordingly removed all female judges from the bench. You are now, officially, a legal expert who is not permitted to be a judge. You consider your options. You could leave. You could change professions. You could stop. Shirin Ebadi did none of these things. She got her lawyer's license and went back to work. Ebadi's legal career after the revolution was a continuous demonstration of a specific form of courage that is often less dramatic to describe than physical bravery, but is in practice equally exhausting and equally dangerous. She took cases that nobody wanted to touch, families of political dissidents killed by government operatives, journalists imprisoned for their reporting, women seeking legal redress in a system structurally weighted against them. She filed briefs in courts run by judges who had every institutional reason to rule against her. She argued from within the law's own framework, citing the constitution and international conventions that Iran had signed, forcing the legal system to account for the gap between its stated principles and its actual practices. This approach, using the law against the law, was both tactically sophisticated and genuinely maddening to the authorities, who would have found outright rejection easier to deal with than an opponent who refused to concede the legal framework and insisted on operating inside it. You can arrest someone for organising a protest. It is considerably more procedurally awkward to arrest someone for filing a legal brief, especially when that person has an international profile and a Nobel Prize and the world is watching. The Nobel, announced in October 2003, was celebrated by reformist and civil society activists in Iran and condemned by hardliners who accused the Nobel Committee of political interference. Ebadi herself received the news in Paris, flew home to Tehran, and was greeted at the airport by thousands of supporters in what became one of the largest spontaneous public gatherings the city had seen in years. The government declined to officially congratulate her. The crowd at the airport did not require official sanction. She continued working in Iran until 2009, when the post-election crackdown made it impossible to operate safely. Her Nobel medal was confiscated by the government, an act without clear legal basis that communicated the authorities' feelings about her work more clearly than any statement. She's lived in exile since then. She continues practicing law and human rights advocacy from outside Iran, with the same relentless efficiency that characterized her work from inside it. The system she argued against is still running. So is she. If you think the mandatory hijab was the only place the Islamic Republic had feelings about women's bodies, you have underestimated the ambition of the project. Marriage age for girls was set at 9 years old in the years immediately following the revolution, a number that was eventually raised through decades of advocacy. But the advocacy was necessary. Divorce laws heavily favoured men. Child custody defaulted to fathers after a certain age. A woman's testimony in court counted for half that of a man's. The diya, or blood money paid in injury cases, was set lower for women than for men. The law had opinions about every part of a woman's life, from the moment she was born to the moment she died, and it was not shy about sharing them. You need your husband's permission to get a passport. This is not a metaphor. This is the law. You're an adult, a citizen of a country, a person with a university degree and a professional career and a reasonably complete interior life, and you need written permission from your husband to obtain a document that allows you to cross an international border. If your husband declines to provide permission, you do not get the passport. If your husband is abusive or controlling or simply indifferent to your need to travel for work, the law is not on your side. The law, in this particular instance, is a tool your husband can use against you. This is not incidental to the law's design. It is the point. The Islamic Republic's legal framework for women was not built from nothing. It drew from classical interpretations of Islamic jurisprudence, filtered through the specific political and theological vision of Khomeini and the clerical establishment that took power in 1979. The result was a legal structure that encoded a particular vision of gender relations into every statute touching family life, marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, testimony, and bodily autonomy, all organized around a framework in which women and men occupied structurally unequal positions before the law. Marriage age is where the numbers become most starkly visible. The minimum age for girls was set at 9 years old, the age of Islamic maturity under the legal interpretation being applied, a number that provoked sustained advocacy from Iranian women's rights organizations, medical professionals, and eventually some clerics. The minimum was raised to 13 in 1991, and further raised in subsequent years, though child marriage remained legally possible with judicial approval well into the 21st century. Each incremental change required years of organized effort by people working within a system that had every structural incentive to maintain the status quo. Divorce law operated with a similar asymmetry. Men could divorce their wives relatively easily through a unilateral declaration. Women seeking divorce needed grounds recognized by the court, which in practice meant demonstrating harm to a judicial system that set a high evidentiary threshold. Women who sought divorce without their husband's cooperation faced years of legal proceedings, financial insecurity, and the near-certain loss of custody of children above a certain age, because custody defaulted to fathers after boys reached 7 and girls reached 9, regardless of who had been the primary caregiver. The cumulative architecture of these laws, passport control, marriage age, divorce access, custody defaults, testimony waiting, inheritance differentials, was not a collection of separate policies. It was a coherent system built to maintain specific power relations within the family and the state simultaneously. Iranian women's rights advocates understood this from the beginning and spent the following decades dismantling it incrementally, one provision at a time, in courtrooms and legislative chambers and public campaigns, with the patience of people who have correctly identified that the work will take longer than they would like and have decided to do it anyway. The slogan that emerged from the protests following Mahsa Amini's death was not accidental. Woman, life, freedom, Jian, Jian, Azadi in Kurdish, captured something that decades of individual acts of resistance had been building toward. The idea that the question of women's rights in Iran was not a separate issue from the question of life itself and freedom itself. That you could not separate the headscarf from the prison cell, the dress code from the disappeared journalist, the morality police from the political system that created them. The protests of 2022 were crushed, as protests in Iran tend to be. But the slogan stayed, and the question it asked about what kind of country Iran would be and for whom had not gone away. The slogan came from Kurdish feminist politics, from a tradition of organising that had been articulating the connection between women's liberation and broader human freedom for decades before the 2022 protests made the phrase globally legible. Jian, Azadi had been chanted in Kurdish communities and in the territories of the Kurdish political movement for years. When it moved into the streets of Tehran in September 2022, it carried that history with it and added a new one. The history of every woman who had pushed a headscarf back a centimetre, every lawyer who had filed a brief in a hostile court, every filmmaker who had said something sideways, every young woman who had voted for Khatami and watched the window close, every mother who had watched her daughter born into the same constraints she had spent her life navigating. The three words function as a logical argument. Woman, naming the subject that the system has tried to manage, regulate, restrict, and control. Life, insisting that the freedom to inhabit your own body is not a political demand but a precondition for existence. Freedom, refusing to accept that these two things are negotiable. The slogan does not ask for reform within the existing framework. It does not propose a slightly more lenient version of the mandatory hijab. It names the connection between the specific and the general, between the headscarf and the whole structure it stands for, and declines to pretend that addressing one without the other is a meaningful solution. The protest lasted for months. They were met with live ammunition, mass arrests, show trials, and executions. The government moved with the speed of an institution that has extensive experience suppressing dissent and understands that the first weeks are the most important. Hundreds of protesters were killed. Thousands were imprisoned. Some were executed on charges of moharabeh, enmity against God, a designation that carries the death penalty and was applied to young people who had been photographed in the street with their hair uncovered. The international community expressed concern. The Islamic Republic continued. And yet the 2022 uprising changed something that previous movements had not fully changed. It named the issue clearly enough, publicly enough, and with enough global visibility that it cannot be easily unnamed. The Iranian government can suppress a protest. It cannot suppress the question the protest asked. It can execute individuals. It cannot execute the argument that a government which controls what women wear is a government that controls women, and that a government that controls women is a government that has decided its citizens are not full people. What comes next in Iran is genuinely uncertain. The Islamic Republic has demonstrated extraordinary resilience across more than 4 decades of internal pressure and external sanction. It has survived wars, economic collapse, and repeated waves of popular protest. It has adapted, retreated, cracked down, and adjusted without ever fundamentally changing. Whether 2022 was the beginning of something different or another chapter in the same long story is a question that only time and the continuing choices of millions of Iranian women will answer. They have been making those choices for 45 years. They are still making them. They have not stopped. While the Islamic Republic controlled the airwaves inside Iran, a parallel Iran was broadcasting from a suburb of Los Angeles, and it was considerably more fun. Persian-language satellite television channels, launched from California starting in the mid-1980s and multiplying rapidly through the 1990s, beamed music videos, talk shows, comedy programs, and news into Iranian living rooms via the same illegal satellite dishes that were simultaneously being confiscated by government patrols. The singers wore what they wanted. The women danced. The hosts made jokes about the government with a freedom that was physically impossible inside the country. Iranians inside Iran watched all of it, avidly, on dishes hidden behind water tanks on apartment rooftops, in the specific way that people consume something they have been told they cannot have. You're sitting in your living room in Tehran in 1995 at 11 o'clock at night. The curtains are drawn. The volume is low enough that it will not carry to the neighbours. whose political reliability you have never fully established. On the screen, a woman in a sequined dress is performing a Persian pop song in front of a glittering backdrop that is unmistakably California. She is not wearing a headscarf. Her arms are bare. She's moving in ways that would result in her arrest if she did this on a street outside your window. She's singing about love with an uncomplicated directness that state-approved Iranian music is not permitted to contain. You know every word. You have known every word since your cousin smuggled the cassette in from Dubai 2 years ago. You sing along, quietly, facing the television with the curtains drawn. The Los Angeles Iranian music industry, affectionately and slightly mockingly called Tarangelis by its critics, was not producing high art by most measures. The production values were modest. The lyrical content was rarely challenging. The aesthetic was a specific kind of 1980s glamour that had been frozen at the moment of departure and preserved, slightly airless, in the California sunshine for decades. None of this mattered in the slightest. What it offered was not sophistication. It offered Persian, secular, joyful, female-inclusive entertainment that was simply unavailable anywhere inside Iran's official cultural production. The contrast with state television, which offered religious programming, war documentaries and news anchors reading government statements, with the enthusiasm of people who have somewhere else to be, was so total that it barely required comment. The satellite channels also carried news, voices critical of the Islamic Republic, interviews with opposition figures, coverage of protests that state media either ignored or framed as foreign-instigated provocations, reporting on political prisoners whose names the government preferred not to circulate. For Iranians who wanted to understand what was happening in their country from a perspective other than the government's, the satellite dish was not entertainment. It was information infrastructure. The Iranian diaspora's cultural production was not limited to Los Angeles, though Los Angeles was its most visible centre. London had Persian language broadcasting. Toronto had publishing. Stockholm had political organisations. The diaspora was not a single community with a unified politics. It ranged from monarchists who wanted the Shah's son restored to radical leftists, to religious reformists, to people who simply wanted to watch television without political content and were not getting it on state channels. What they shared was access to platforms that Iranians inside the country were denied, and most of them used those platforms to communicate back across the border with the persistence of people who had left something they intended to remain connected to. The culture that travelled in both directions, the music smuggled in, the news broadcast out, the phone calls, the money transfers, the satellite signals bouncing off dishes on Tehran rooftops, was not a substitute for political change. But it maintained, across decades, the knowledge that a different version of Iranian life was possible, that the version being enforced at home was a choice, not an inevitability, and that knowledge, distributed through a satellite signal at 11 o'clock at night to a living room with the curtains drawn, was its own form of resistance. Under the Islamic Republic, the mixing of unmarried men and women in private spaces was illegal. Public displays of affection were arrestable, and dating in the ordinary sense of two, people spending time together to determine whether they wanted to spend more time together, did not officially exist. What existed instead was a vast, creative, entirely extralegal infrastructure of romance that Iranians constructed and maintained with the ingenuity of people who've been told that a fundamental human activity is forbidden and have decided that the prohibition is not, in practice, going to stop them. The system was workaround all the way down, and by the time you reached adulthood in the Islamic Republic, navigating it was simply a standard life skill, like parallel parking or reading a bus schedule. You like someone. This is, under the circumstances, already somewhat complicated. You cannot ask them for coffee because mixed gender socializing in public is technically prohibited and practically surveilled. You cannot invite them to your apartment because an unmarried man and woman alone together in a private space is illegal and subject to the specific horror of a knock on the door from the morality police, which would result in arrest, family notification, and a variety of consequences, none of which are good. You cannot be seen holding hands on the street because public displays of affection are subject to intervention from the same patrol that monitors headscarves and coats. What you can do is coordinate a route through a park where the patrols are less frequent, meet in the context of a group gathering that provides plausible social cover, and conduct an entire courtship through a phone that you keep on silent in your coat pocket and check with the practiced casualness of someone who is absolutely not checking their phone. The practical management of romance under the Islamic Republic produced adaptations at every level of the process. Parks became the primary venue for young couples who had nowhere else to go. Tehran's parks, particularly in the northern parts of the city, functioned as informal meeting grounds where couples walked at a careful distance that could be adjusted instantly if needed. The mountain trails north of Tehran served a similar function, the altitude providing both scenery and a reduced probability of police encounter. Cars became private spaces in a city where private spaces were scarce. A car parked in a quiet street was technically subject to police inspection, but was considerably harder to monitor systematically than a park. The legal institution of muta, temporary marriage, permitted under Shia Islam for a specified period ranging from an hour to years, was occasionally invoked as a framework that made certain relationships technically permissible. Its use for this purpose was widely known, widely practiced, and officially disapproved of by the same government that had technically made it available, which is the kind of institutional contradiction that the Islamic Republic generated with impressive regularity. Marriage itself, when it eventually arrived, involved its own negotiations between official requirements and personal reality. The marriage contract under Iranian law gave husbands significant legal advantages over divorce, over custody, over the wife's right to work or travel, that had to be individually addressed through specific contract clauses that women's rights advocates had spent decades publicizing and that families increasingly knew to request. The marriage contract, theoretically a religious document, had become, in practice, a site of ongoing feminist legal strategy, with NGOs distributing information about which protective clauses were available, how to request them, and which ones courts had consistently honoured. Love, in the Islamic Republic, required paperwork. Here is what did not happen. Iranian women did not disappear. They did not become the uniform, silent, domestically confined figures that the Islamic Republic's founding ideology had drawn up as its blueprint for the ideal female citizen. They did not stop being educated, or ambitious, or politically aware, or creative, or furious, or determined. They did not accept that the version of womanhood on offer was the only version available. They pushed headscarves back by centimetres, and fought in courtrooms and made films that said everything sideways and voted in enormous numbers and marched in the street and cut their hair in public and raised daughters who did all of the same things with more information and less patience. Across 50 years of a system designed to contain them, Iranian women remained irreducibly themselves. You're standing somewhere at the end of this story, and the story has not ended. That is important to hold on to. Histories of political repression tend toward narrative closure. The system falls, the people are freed, the arc bends toward justice in a satisfying final paragraph. The history of Iranian women under the Islamic Republic does not currently offer this. The Republic is still running. The mandatory hijab, despite being suspended in its formal enforcement, remains law. The legal inequalities are still largely in place. The women who were executed after 2022 for the act of standing in the street without a headscarf are still dead. The story is ongoing, which means it is not a story yet. It is a life being lived. What the preceding 50 years demonstrate, across all their specificity and horror and ingenuity and grief, is something about the relationship between political systems and the people they attempt to govern. The Islamic Republic built an apparatus of extraordinary comprehensiveness, legal, institutional, physical, ideological, to produce a particular kind of Iranian woman. It did not produce her. It produced instead a population of women who had become expert at surviving comprehensive control while maintaining interior lives, professional ambitions, political convictions, and personal identities that the control apparatus could regulate at the surface but could not reach at the depth. This is not a comfortable triumphalist conclusion. The cost of that survival was real and continues to be real. Every woman who spent 40 years performing compliance in public and being herself, only in private paid a price in the sheer daily exhaustion of the performance. Every woman who was arrested, beaten, imprisoned or executed paid a price that cannot be romanticized into resilience. Every woman who left paid a price in distance from the country she loved. The resilience is real. So is what it cost. What Iranian women have preserved, across everything, is the knowledge of what they are owed, not as a political slogan, though it has become one, but as a lived understanding, carried in the bodies of women who have navigated the gap between what was permitted and what was real for their entire adult lives, and have not, in that navigation, confused the gap for the world. They know what the world should look like. They have been building it in whatever space was available, every single day. The woman in the miniskirt in 1968 Tehran and the woman who cut her hair in the street in Tehran in 2022 are not the same woman. They are separated by revolution, war, economic collapse, political cycles, and 54 years of compounded history. But they share something that the Islamic Republic, for all its institutional thoroughness, was never able to legislate out of existence. The absolute certainty that their bodies are their own, their choices are their own, and the country that contains them belongs to them as fully as to anyone who has ever held power over it. That certainty was not given to them. They kept it. Through everything, they kept it. And on the evidence of 50 years, they are not about to stop. So here you are, warm, horizontal, somewhere safe, in a bed that belongs to you, in a body that belongs to you, wearing whatever you fell asleep in, which is nobody's business but your own. Take a moment with that, not as a political statement, just as a fact. The small, ordinary, extraordinary fact of an evening in which nobody knocked on your door to assess your appearance. Tonight you travelled through 50 years of one of history's most dramatic social transformations. A country that went from miniskirts to mandatory hijabs in the span of a single revolution, and then spent the next 4 decades watching its women refuse, in every way available to them, to be reduced to the version of themselves the revolution had planned. You met women who marched for a revolution, and then turned around and marched against it 8 days later. Women who pushed a headscarf back by a centimetre every single morning for 40 years, because a centimetre was what was available and a centimetre was worth fighting for. Women who sat in courtrooms arguing the law against itself. Women who made films about everything they could not say by becoming the most celebrated filmmakers in the world. Women who cut their hair in the street knowing exactly what it meant and doing it anyway. They were not all heroes in the clean, uncomplicated way that history sometimes offers. They were people, exhausted, creative, angry, grieving, sometimes wrong, sometimes divided against each other, always navigating a situation that offered no good options and required constant, impossible choices. They lived double lives, because double lives were what survival required. They left when leaving was the only way to remain themselves. They stayed when staying was an act of defiance that nobody outside could see. They did all of this without being asked, without being thanked, and in most cases without being remembered by name. History keeps the names of the people in power. It is slower to keep the names of the people who resisted power in the small, daily, unspectacular ways that do not make for easy monuments. But the resistance was real. The cost was real. And the fact that Iranian women are still here, still educated, still organised, still pushing, still present in every professional and public space that was supposed to exclude them, is the accumulated result of millions of individual mornings when someone got dressed and decided, one more time, not to disappear. Somewhere in Tehran tonight, a woman is getting ready for tomorrow. Maybe she's adjusting something. Maybe she is not. Maybe she is tired in the specific way of someone who's been doing this for a very long time and is going to keep doing it anyway. She does not need your pity. She does not need your rescue. She needs what everyone engaged in a long struggle needs, to be seen clearly, without simplification, and to know that the rest of the world understands what is actually at stake. You understand a little more of that tonight than you did this morning. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole point of staying up past your bedtime with a stranger's history. Now, let the lights go all the way down. Let the sounds of wherever you are settle into the background. Let the 50 years of courage and fury and creativity and grief that you just travelled through settle gently into something quieter. The knowledge that the world contains more resilience than is visible from the outside, that ordinary people in impossible situations find ways to remain themselves, and that this has always been true, everywhere, in every era, under every system that has ever tried to make people smaller than they are. People are stubborn like that. Beautifully, impossibly, stubbornly like that. Sleep well.